You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
How are you doing today there, Mr. Thomas? Is it a wonderful, beautiful day out there in Connecticut?
It's just fine. We're just back from a few days off at Cape Cod. We had a wonderful time and visited with family. Very relaxing. And I tried to do as little as possible. That was actually a good goal.
It is the best goal. When you're going to the beach, you should do as little as possible. And I say that having just gone to the beach myself and made a point of doing as much as possible.
Wait a minute. As much or as little?
I'm one of those people that when I get to a place, I like to go places. So I went to 3 different beaches to shell hunt. I went for a 5-mile run around the Wright Memorial, which commemorates Orville and Wilbur Wright's first flight. I mean, I called my significant other and he was like, why would you go for a 5-mile run when you're supposed to be relaxing? And I said, I just don't feel right sitting still. Even though I was supposed to be relaxing, I did more than I probably ought to have, considering that it was just supposed to be go to the beach, hunt for shells, and have fun.
A 5-mile run, though, for an athlete such as yourself, was probably relaxing.
It was a nice challenge to try to run up the monument. It's a rough hill, so I did run, I would say about ran 3/4 of the way up. In the last quarter, I had to walk because it was a hard run.
This is the hill where they flew the airplane?
Mm-hmm. There's a really wonderful, really beautiful monument up at the top. And so you can walk up the hill a number of different ways and then get to the monument at the top. And then you can see all the way down the hill and the path where they took their first flight. It's really great for anybody who's local who hasn't gone down to the Wright Memorial. Go. It's wonderful. It's a nice monument to an important moment in history. Went for a run up the hill.
Now, in my mind, never having been to the location, seen movies and that sort of thing, I picture this as being out in the dunes and still in its wild, natural state. Is that the case?
It's a National Park Service site, so there is a visitor center and everything like that. But the actual memorial itself it's out there. They built the visitor center away from the hill, so you do have to walk to get out there. It is very pretty. It's not actually in the dunes. The dunes are a little further out. Jockey's Ridge, which is the largest sand dune in the area, that's a little further away. Once you get to the top of the monument, you can see the ocean from there, which is pretty cool. You can see it on all sides. And it's very nice. You do need to come to the Outer Banks at some point or another. I've gone to see you. You need to come down here.
Absolutely.
And go to the Outer Banks. It's wonderful.
It's on our list. We would very much like to go to the Outer Banks based on the reports we've heard from you and many other people who love the Outer Banks.
Now we've reached the end of our summer here. No more vacation for either of us. And as we go about trying to figure out what topics are we going to cover as I head into the new school year and Bill continues his tireless work on the Colonial Parkway Murders case and other cases, we have to start thinking, what is it that we're going to be presenting our audience with as we move into fall and then winter? And we had been spinning our wheels on a specific topic that we thought would be very interesting for our audience. We just weren't entirely sure how to go about presenting it. I thought it would be neat for us to cover the profile of a presidential assassin or a would-be presidential assassin. But considering that neither Bill nor I are profilers, we were trying to figure out who do we tap in to do the reporting on this. Do we get Jim Fitzgerald? Do we get Jim Clemente? Do we get Dr. Ray Carr? Who do we get? And lo and behold, the New York Times Magazine published a piece that really solved the problem of how do we talk about this for us. And the New York Times Magazine on July 25th, 2024, put up a very interesting piece of long-form reporting from a reporter named Mark O'Connell. This was the lead story in the New York Times Magazine, and it is titled John Hinckley Jr. and the Madness of American Political Violence. John Hinckley Jr., of course, is somebody that I think we're all familiar with. Bill, do you remember where you were when Reagan was nearly assassinated?
I don't know if I can tell you specifically where I was at that moment, but I do remember when we heard the shocking news that Reagan had been shot. At the time it was initially reported, I'm not sure they said whether President Reagan had been badly enough injured to threaten his life, but we knew it was very serious, and we knew that multiple people had been shot. A couple of weeks ago, when former President Trump was shot at in Butler, Pennsylvania, that brought some of these memories back in pretty sharp relief, because the very disturbing news, it comes as such a shock when something like this happens. Mm-hmm. And then you're very concerned about, was the president or former president injured? Were other people injured, which did happen in the Butler, Pennsylvania shooting? It seems like such a peculiarly American phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And it just saddens me so profoundly to see these things happening over and over again. I know we've talked about it a little bit before on Mind Over Murder, and Mark O'Connell, the writer here, talks about how this type of political violence directed at our leaders is one thing, and then there's so many similarities between this and mass shooters, of which we've seen so many here in the U.S. It's a very disturbing long-term trend that's certainly been going on for decades.
One of the, I don't think side effects is quite the right word, but that's what I've got in my brain right now, so we'll go with that. One of the interesting side effects of growing up in Williamsburg, Virginia, is we have two, I would say, really famous or maybe notorious criminal cases associated with this area. One, of course, brought me to you, Bill, and that is the Colonial Parkway Murders. But the other case that you really can't help hearing about if you grow up here in Williamsburg, Virginia, is about John Hinckley Jr. Because for as long as I can remember, he has been granted leave to leave St. Elizabeth's Hospital, where he was confined after being found not guilty by reason of insanity. He has been granted leave from the hospital to come visit his parents, and that is something that I was aware of pretty much all my life. And then, of course, several years ago, when all of the restrictions on John Hinckley were lifted and he came to live here permanently, full-time, that is something that we spent a little bit of time talking about here on the podcast. John Hinckley Jr. is a name that really is just intertwined with Williamsburg in general. For those of us who have lived here most of our lives, as I have, that's just a name that you become familiar with, just as you become familiar with the Colonial Parkway Murders, and just as you become familiar with other things unrelated to crime, like Bruce Hornsby, who is our resident rock musician. John Hinckley is just someone that, if you live here, you're familiar with that name. And so when I saw this article, I was particularly interested in the author's reasoning behind writing it right now and what he had to say about this very uniquely American phenomenon of American political violence and shootings. What we wanted to do today, we did want to share it with everybody, and we wanted to take some time to go through the article and then offer some color commentary on our thoughts on the material, because it is very interesting, and he ties in all the various intersections between politics, pop culture, and violence and crime. And it's a very interesting and engaging article that we wanted to make sure you, our listeners, were able to spend a little bit of time with. So I think what we'll go ahead and do today, this is definitely going to be a 2-episoder because it is quite a long piece of reporting. Very well done. And so what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we will go through and do this paragraph by paragraph, offer color commentary as needed, and further discussion as warranted, and we'll go from there. We will put a link to this article in our show notes, but for anybody who wants to search it up immediately to follow along with us, it is from the New York Times Magazine, the July 25th issue, 2024. And the title of the article is John Hinckley Jr. and the Madness of American Political Violence.
Before we start, just a quick reminder, we had discussed John Hinckley Jr. once before with our friend Mark Olshaker in an earlier episode of Mind Over Murder, which is a very interesting discussion, and we'll link to that in the show notes as well.
This piece is from author Mark O'Connell. He is a writer from Dublin who actually came to Williamsburg and spoke to John Hinckley Jr. over the course of 3 days to do this article. In September 2016, 3.5 decades after he shot President Ronald Reagan in a deranged bid to impress the actress Jodie Foster, a crime for which he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, John W. Hinckley Jr. was released from St. Elizabeth's Psychiatric Hospital in Washington, D.C. From there, he moved to Williamsburg, Virginia, where he lived for some years with his elderly mother, Joanne, in a large house overlooking the 13th hole of a golf course. The federal court that granted his release did so on certain conditions. One of these was that he must not speak to the media. Another was that Hinckley, who was a songwriter for some years before the failed assassination attempt, and who continued to play music as part of his psychiatric treatment, must not release for public consumption, even anonymously, any of his work without the specific approval of the treatment team entrusted with his care. If I'm remembering correctly, Bill, that is referencing the Son of Sam law, which says that someone who has been convicted of a crime cannot benefit from their work.
That's my recollection as well. And I also remember Mark Olshaker weighing in very strongly that he felt that Hinckley should not be released back in 2016, that he thought it was a terrible mistake. I do find it odd that a man who shot 4 people, one of whom ultimately died from his injuries, James Brady, the former president's press secretary. I'd have to agree with Mark that I find it really difficult to accept the fact that Hinckley's out and about, but so be it. So continuing the article, after his arrest, Hinckley was diagnosed with, among other conditions, atypical psychosis and severe narcissistic personality disorder. His extravagantly strange and violent actions have been bound up in a toxic fascination with celebrity and an egomaniacal glee at the fame those actions brought him. Although Hinckley's treatment was successful and the judge was satisfied that he presented a very low risk of reoffending, the restrictions were intended to ensure that he neither courted nor was courted by the media, and that his mental stability would not be threatened in the immediate aftermath of his release by widespread attention.
I was always a little surprised by the fact that there was not much coverage outside of a couple of articles about the fact that Hinckley had been released. I have always been surprised. I keep waiting for the day that he's going to find his way onto someone's true crime podcast. There have been people who, my own parents have asked, have you ever thought about interviewing John Hinckley Jr. for your podcast? And I've told them I can't think of a circumstance under which I actually want to talk to him. I don't know that I want to spend time chatting with a man who tried to assassinate the president. I don't know that I have that in me to do. How would you feel about it?
I can't see us doing it either. And then there's something about it. If we talk about someone's new book or a film project or television series or whatever, I think there's an implication that we feel this is worthwhile, that we feel this is worth bringing some attention to, and that we want to talk to this person because we think they've got something to contribute to the larger conversation, not just here on Mind Over Murder. I think there's an implied endorsement when we say Catherine Miles' book Trailed is worth reading, or you should check out this new book by this author or that author. I wouldn't want anyone to ever think that you and I were somehow promoting or supporting John Hinckley. And they talk about this in the article. We'll get into more details. He's an aspiring singer-songwriter, has been for a number of years, and he's actually attempted to go out on tour. He was supposed to be up here in the Northeast doing tour dates. I don't know. There's something about it that just gives me the creeps. And I think to myself, well, I have no doubt that the conversation with Hinckley might be interesting. I don't want to do anything that's going to promote that guy or that's going to say, we think this guy is particularly worth spending 45 minutes with.
Now, I'm sure that there are people who are going to say, okay, but then why are you spending time talking about this article about him? There's a whole lot more, I think, that needs to be examined. And this author is doing it through the lens of Hinckley. because he's a living political assassin. He's not incarcerated. He was not killed. He is here. He is out. He is among us. The way that he is examining Hinckley and his motivations for attempting to shoot the president, I think they say a lot larger things about our culture than just about him by himself. And that is why we're willing to have a conversation about this article, but not with Hinckley himself. In 2022, not long after his mother died, the last of those restrictions were lifted. More than 4 decades after shooting Ronald Reagan, along with a Secret Service agent named Timothy McCarthy, a police officer named Thomas Dilley, and Reagan's press secretary, James Brady, who was left permanently disabled, he was, at 67 years of age, truly free. Hinckley had by then opened a Twitter account and amassed thousands of followers. On June 15th, 2022, the day the restrictions were lifted, he posted the following, quote, "After 41 years, 2 months, and 15 days, freedom at last," end quote. His following grew, and he quickly began to use his platform to release music and promote upcoming gigs. He announced a total of 12 performances. Unsurprisingly, these shows got a lot of attention and began to sell out, but every single one of them was canceled before he could play as a result of backlash, including anonymous threatening emails received by the venues. And I remember very distinctly when our own Williamsburg Regional Library up here, which has a beautiful auditorium, was advertising on their page, "Hey, John Hinckley is going to do a concert here." There was immediate backlash from the entire community. They were like, why would you put him on your stage? Why would you do that? The man tried to assassinate the president. Why would you put him on there? And almost immediately they had to cancel the show.
I understand it. When they put other dates in other parts of the country, people push back hard, and I get it. I'm not a proponent of cancel culture or any of that. Makes me roll my eyes a bit. I get why people were upset. This guy is a presidential assassin. He shot 4 people, and I don't know why, of all the people on the planet and all the singer-songwriters, why do we have to promote John Hinckley? I completely understand it. So the article continues, this made Hinckley a figure of prurient interest on social media. When he posted about his excitement for an upcoming show, for instance, along with a selfie in which he stared directly at the camera with a glazed and entirely affectless expression, I just picture him with no emotion. Mm-hmm. The replies were a chorus of ironic quips and jokes. Someone replied with a gif of Travis Bickle, that's the killer in Taxi Driver, clapping, a reference to Hinckley's most famous inspiration for his crime and obsession with Taxi Driver and with Jodie Foster, who played the teenage prostitute Iris in the film. Quote, haven't heard his new stuff, but I like his earlier work, unquote, read another. Jokes about Hinckley's early work follow him everywhere online. For a majority of people who encountered his internet presence, Hinckley was an absurd and quintessentially American aberration. A guy who shot and very nearly killed the president and was somehow still alive to sing his songs about peace and love and redemption.
It's a unique place that he finds himself in. I think I would put it right on par with, say, Leslie Van Houten, who received parole a year ago, the last of the Manson family killers, or the most recent of the Manson family killers to be paroled. I think that would be tantamount to Leslie Van Houten deciding to go on speaking tour. Why do you want to support someone who has done these horrible things? And yet it does amaze me that he has this many followers on social media. I saw the face you just made. There's an ick factor to it almost.
Yeah, it's cringy. It really is.
You use the word the youth would use. You said, actually, I've been told that the youth are no longer using cringy.
What are they saying? Cringe?
I don't actually even know. But whatever it is, I'm going to have to adjust my slang accordingly.
You're going to be surrounded by young people in, what, a week? Bill?
Yeah, I'm going to have to learn all the newest pieces of slang lingo. And so on and so forth. and even if I don't actually go out and look for it, it's going to find me nonetheless.
It will filter.
This is what happens when you work in a high school.
Exactly. So if cringe is not the word, I'm sure you'll find out what it is.
Yeah, at some point or another. But I will still continue to use cringe and cringy, and that will usually make them roll their eyes again. Miss Dilley, nobody says that anymore. All right, the article continues. Then 43 years after that near assassination in Butler, Pennsylvania, a 20-year-old loner named Thomas Matthew Crooks took several shots at Donald Trump with a semi-automatic rifle, wounding the former president's right ear and plunging an already dark and chaotic world even deeper into darkness and chaos. Hinckley now became the focus of a different kind of interest. After the shooting, he posted the following message on the platform now known as X, quote, "Violence is not the way to go. Give peace a chance," unquote. He was quoting his old hero, John Lennon, who was himself murdered by a strange and sick and lonely young man with a gun. The tweet provoked a by now predictable response. There were gifs of Jodie Foster looking haunted. Hope she sees this, bro. And of Travis Bickle talking to himself in the mirror. There was an article in The Guardian headlined, "Man who tried to assassinate Reagan says violence is not the way to go." Mostly, people seem to be able to respond to the message only as evidence of the further derangement of things.
I get the derangement response because, man, is it rich listening to Hinckley quote John Lennon, who was himself assassinated in 1980. That's another situation where I remember exactly where I was. And
where were you? I'm just curious.
I was at home, and the news came in that evening. It was December 8th, I believe, 1980, and I just remember being so profoundly saddened by this news. John Lennon never did anything to anybody and was supposedly someone that Mark David Chapman, his assassin, looked up to. The whole thing is just so profoundly sad. There's something that's really almost offensive about Hinckley quoting John Lennon. He's right. Violence is not the way to go. I'm not sure he's the right messenger here.
No, exactly.
Hinckley might agree in a sense. He had long held the belief that the country was too divided and there were too many guns. Quote, "The political climate here in America is just so volatile," he told me when I got him on the phone. I asked him how he felt about the whole thing. There was a long silence, and eventually I heard him sigh. He's a slow talker who often pauses at length between thoughts, and in the short time I had known him, I had learned to ride out the silences, to let him continue at his own pace. He said then, in a tone of stoic resignation, "I wish it hadn't happened."
It was a couple of days after the shooting, late at night in Dublin, where I live, and early evening in Williamsburg. He was getting a lot of media requests, he said, but had so far turned them all down. He was an object once again of intense curiosity, as though, having shot at a president and lived, he was somehow a proxy for Crooks, who was killed just seconds after his attempt on Trump's life. It's possible, after all, that we will never know what led Crooks to try to kill the former president. But in Hinckley, we are presented with a kind of living antecedent, through whose former delusions we might begin to understand the currents of violence and culture-wide madness that seem to act so strongly on certain solitary and obsessive men who continue to cause such turbulence in the flow of American history. That line at that point, when I started reading this article, I was like, oh, this is exactly what I wanted us to talk about. But I could not have articulated it in such a coherent and cohesive manner. Props to Mark O'Connell. This is exactly what I wanted to say, but I didn't have the capability to say it that way. I was so excited to read this article. I was all in at this point.
Yeah, it's beautifully written. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. Before we get back to the podcast, just wanted to remind you that we have a GoFundMe effort going on right now. This campaign is designed to help us raise funds to help promote Mind Over Murder and specifically to push the Colonial Parkway Murders investigation forward. We'd love it if you could support us in any way that you can. Any donation from $5 to whatever you can afford is very much appreciated and will be incredibly helpful. The link is in the show notes and in our social media pages. As always, thanks for your support. Now back to Mind Over Murder. This tragedy recently with Thomas Matthew Crooks and his attempted assassination of former President Trump. I know they're investigating what happened that day and the failures of the Secret Service, how Crooks was allowed to get within 150 yards or so of the former president. although he didn't kill Trump, he did kill a former firefighter who was there with his family, and then terribly injured two other people who were also listening to former President Trump speak. There's intense curiosity as to what Crook's motivations may have been. And I was reading an article this morning, preparing for today. This doesn't even seem to be something that was politically motivated when it comes to Crooks. He was a registered Republican, but he'd given a small amount of money, I think $15, to a group that promotes progressive values. He had researched both former President Trump's whereabouts as well as current President Biden's whereabouts, and even looked into senior people within the Biden administration. It almost feels apolitical somehow on Crooks's part. He died almost immediately, within seconds of shooting at the former president. He was dead, shot by a Secret Service sniper. I know that there are a lot of people, including the team that's currently investigating what went wrong here, that would dearly love to have talked to Crooks, but obviously that can't happen. We find ourselves returning to have conversations with people like Hinckley. I understand the intense curiosity and our desire to learn more. Can we make any sense out of any of this?
I had by then been talking to Hinckley for 3.5 months, since a New York Post story about the cancellation of his shows, in which he'd called himself a victim of cancel culture, had gained widespread attention online. This exact pattern, Hinckley announces a concert. Online commenters make jokes about his early work. The venue receives backlash and cancels the show, had played out a dozen or so times since Hinckley's restrictions were lifted. It struck me as both farcical and poignant, the way that he kept being thwarted in his efforts to share his music with the world.
The song Cry Me a River comes to mind, doesn't it?
I was thinking World's Smallest Violin.
Exactly.
Playing the world's saddest story.
In mid-May, I went to Virginia, this is Williamsburg now, to spend time with him. We talked about his music and about his strange and terrible past and about his effort at age 69 to move on from it. I talked to people who collaborated with him on getting his music out to the world. A promoter, a guitar teacher, a graphic designer who worked on his records and merchandise, a woman whom he referred to as his assistant. When I thought about the disturbing things he did in 1981, there was a distinct sense of cognitive dissonance. I found it hard to square that 25-year-old madman with the quiet and melancholy older fellow who just wanted to put out what he called his, quote, message of peace, unquote. They were different men, but also were very much not.
I think this dichotomy of Hinckley, where here is what he did versus what he is now, I find that really compelling and interesting. I don't know that Hinckley is the sort of person, if I saw him in Williamsburg, and interestingly enough, I have never had a John Hinckley sighting. Bill, I remember one of the first times that you were down here, you and I had a Bruce Hornsby sighting, and I call it Bruce in the Wild. Bruce Hornsby just happened to be sitting at a booth at Plaza Azteca where the two of us were having dinner, which was a pretty jazzy thing for both of us. It was neat. I've lived here my whole entire life. I see Bruce Hornsby a lot. My dad actually sees him even more. He's on a first name basis with him, which is pretty cool. But I've never had a John Hinckley sighting. Part of me does wonder why that might be. I am constantly out and about running errands and stuff like that. But I have officially seen Bruce Hornsby out in the wild more often than I've seen John Hinckley out in the wild. And I'm always a little curious about why that is. I am wondering how low a profile he actually keeps.
I see Bruce Hornsby as a force for good music and lots of worthwhile social causes. I've also met and spent the day with Bruce Hornsby some years ago when I was working for ASCAP. If I had the opportunity, I might reintroduce myself to Bruce and remind him where we met. But I wouldn't do it at dinner because you don't interrupt someone when they're having dinner at Plaza Azteca, you said?
Plaza Azteca, yeah.
I see Bruce Hornsby as nothing but a great ambassador for the community of Williamsburg. I guess if you hung out even more than you do now in bookstores and music stores, you might run into Hinckley. I wouldn't go out of my way for the guy.
But it is interesting, though, that because this is still a relatively small town. Like all things considered, Williamsburg's still a small town. It's a big little small town, but it's still a small town. I had initially worried it would be hard to write about Hinckley in a way that wasn't exploitative or otherwise morally compromising. What if he was still in some way mentally unstable? What if he was so heavily medicated or so badly damaged by his own past that it would be impossible to conduct the sort of conversation I needed to have with him in order to write about him?
Over the conversations I had with Hinckley, these doubts fell away. I eventually came to think of him as a Rip Van Winkle figure who had been confined for almost the entirety of the era of modern telecommunications and had not directly experienced the seismic shifts that had taken place in the culture he was emerging back into. And that culture is one where Hinckley's particular derangements, obsessive identification with fictional characters and celebrities, delusions of grandeur, the conjuring of rich alternative realities have become strangely normalized, at least on the platforms where Hinckley now interacts with his fans. Platforms where, it must be said, a sufficiently committed loner can become infamous overnight without firing a single shot. And the more I considered him, the more strangely serene Hinckley seemed to me against the context of everything that was going on, at least not the inscrutable political violence of which he himself was such a highly charged symbol.
It is very interesting. Hinckley went into St. Elizabeth's in 1981-82, the year I was born, and he finally was released from all restrictions on that 2 years ago. So that is a really long stretch of time to be out of sync with the, as Mr. O'Connell puts them, seismic shifts in culture that happened. I'm from the generation, I guess exennial is how you call me. I'm a Gen X / millennial, exennial. I remember having a childhood without internet and then going to college with it being full steam. And now I can't imagine a situation in which I wouldn't have an internet connected device somewhere. Hinckley never got any of that. He was in St. Elizabeth's the whole entire time. It's got to be, I think the Rip Van Winkle reference is accurate. And of course, the English teacher in me loves that. The literary character who took a nap for many years. I think that's really apt. And so I think this is a very interesting paragraph here about Hinckley and reminding everybody this is a guy who went to institutionalization for this horrible crime. And when he came out, the entire world had changed.
He was in St. Elizabeth's for your entire life, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. And as I said earlier in the podcast, growing up, we would always hear, because the local newspaper would report on it, Hinckley is out on a supervised visit with his parents. There was a huge to-do when he was allowed to have weekend visits and then longer and longer. And there was quite a bit of coverage when he was finally released from all of the restrictions at St. Elizabeth's and was allowed to live here permanently. I'm sure that there was a heck of a flap in King's Mill that what a conversation to have. The neighborhood assassin is coming home to live. That had to have been an interesting conversation. Okay, the article continues, I come from Ireland, a country with a long and complicated history of political violence. For most of this history, which stretches back through centuries of colonial dispossession, such violence arose in one way or another out of a struggle for national self-determination. When what are now called non-state actors committed deeds of terror and violence, they did so by and large within the context of a coherent political project. Say what you like, for instance, about the IRA's failed attempt in 1984 to assassinate Margaret Thatcher by blowing up a hotel in Brighton, but you can't say that it was totally inexplicable. You didn't have to agree morally with the aims or the methodologies of violence to understand them.
What is disturbing for me is that these political assassins here in the United States, so much of it just seems aimless and baseless and completely pathetic. I understand why the people of Ireland, and particularly Northern Ireland, may have wanted to kill Margaret Thatcher. I'm not saying I think that was a good idea or that she necessarily deserved it. At least there's a political means to an end here. Political assassinations in the United States, for the most part, particularly when the assassin survives and has an opportunity perhaps to be heard in court or speak at some point, none of it ever seems to make any sense to me. It's all about self-aggrandizement. Typically, they're pretty pathetic, and this is just their way of achieving fame, infamy, perhaps.
Yeah, there was an excellent podcast out a couple of years ago from our friends over at Tenderfoot TV called the RFK tapes. And that was a lot of discussion about Robert Kennedy's assassination at the hands of, and the motivations behind that one have been hotly debated. Very interesting stuff. But I like your characterization of aimless. It feels like, what is the point in this? I don't know enough about RFK and his political ideology to be able to pinpoint a reason why I would have wanted him dead. What was the point of that? He was universally beloved, as far as I can tell. What is the point in taking out this guy who was really only trying to do good things for the country? I will never understand it.
Agreed. O'Connell continues, and this picks up on some of these themes. The tradition of political violence in the United States is of an entirely different order, and it seems to me to arise out of the conjoined American traditions of entrepreneurial individualism and gun ownership. The presiding archetype of such violence in American life is not a revolutionary in a balaclava backed by a paramilitary organization, but a lonely oddball with a firearm fixation and a complex of conspiratorial grievances, whose relationship to the political dynamics of his country is often highly inscrutable, or, in any case, disconnected from any organized political project. This is a confused and confusing figure. Lee Harvey Oswald, James Earl Ray, these non-entities who seized for themselves a place in history, even a kind of perverse greatness, by murdering great men.
Could not have said that or articulated that any better.
No, it's beautifully written. And he's really capturing the essence of something that I think we need to be thinking about. Crooks is another person in this long list of kind of bizarre nobodies that are going to try to kill political leaders in a way that doesn't even seem to make sense. There's no philosophical underpinning here. They just want to kill this individual to claim their, 15 minutes of fame from behind bars?
John Hinckley Jr. was both an extreme and an imperfect example of this archetype, not least because he failed. On a psychological level, he had less in common with practitioners of political murder from other cultures and times. The unknown assassin of the revolutionary leader Michael Collins during the Irish Civil War, say, or Gavrilo Princip, the Serbian nationalist who sparked the First World War by killing Archduke Franz Ferdinand, than he did with the other major avatar of American carnage, the mass shooter. He was a lonely and tormented boy whose mental illness absorbed and intensified many of the dark energies of American culture. The interplay between cinematic and actual violence, the devotional relationship with fame, and the conviction that heroic self-definition can be achieved through an act of violence. His motives were not exactly obscure, but his politics were incoherent and largely irrelevant to his deed.
The same can't be confidently said of Thomas Matthew Crooks, who came within inches of assassinating a former and perhaps future president. Not yet, at least, for the simple reason that almost nothing can confidently be said of him. Reporters have sketched a broad outline of his life. Crooks came from a middle-class suburb of Pittsburgh, and high school classmates described him as intelligent, geeky, and a bit of a loner. He liked playing video games and shooting guns. We know that he was a registered Republican, but we also know that he donated $15 to a nonprofit dedicated to increasing voter turnout for Democrats. Having unlocked his phone, the FBI found that he searched for the date of both Trump's rally in Butler and the Democratic National Convention, and for pictures of Biden and Trump, as well as high-level federal appointees in the Biden administration. Maybe there's a version of this story yet to be told in which Crooks and his actions do make sense. Maybe investigators find some detail buried deep in the data hoard, some glimmering shard left behind in the digital recesses that somehow illuminates it all. But also maybe not. Maybe unimaginable chaos was nearly unleashed on the United States for no better reason than that Butler was a little over an hour's drive from his parents' house. And maybe Crooks remains legible, if at all, only as a late and sad entry into the canon of the lonely American man who takes a shot at the president, an archetype of which John Hinckley Jr. was, until very recently, the most vivid contemporary example.
I don't know where exactly, if anywhere, it would make sense for Hinckley to be living in freedom 43 years after shooting Ronald Reagan. But Williamsburg, the former capital of the Virginia colony, with its restored 18th century buildings and its tourist economy, feels like a particularly strange outcome. The town, whose historical center bills itself as the world's largest living history museum, amounts to a sort of immersive infotainment experience on the theme of America's colonial period. During my visit there in May, I saw many men in period garb, waistcoats, breeches, tricorn hats, addressing clusters of tourists in stentorian fashion about Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. There are frequent outdoor performances by fife and drum outfits. There are, I would guess, more gift shops per capita than any American town other than Orlando. I would take exception with that, by the way.
I did laugh when I read that, though.
I don't think that's true. As I walked the broad promenades of the historical center, the only traffic on which was horse-drawn carts full of tourists, I encountered several groups of small boys fighting pitched battles with wooden swords and toy muskets. He's not wrong on that part. I do take a little bit of umbrage on behalf of my city. We don't have that many gift shops.
Okay, if you say so. I like Williamsburg just fine.
I was going to say, you've been here.
Yes.
Are we crawling with gift shops?
Not that I recall, but perhaps for a Dubliner, it might have felt that way.
Okay, true enough. Okay. There is so much interesting discussion and conversation to continue unpacking with this article that we are going to bring it to a close right now. We're about halfway through the article. And for anybody who thinks that maybe we're taking a little too long to read this, you can actually have someone at the New York Times read this to you. There is a link to the article, and that is 40 full minutes long without any of our sparkling and incisive commentary. So we actually think you're getting the better part of the deal by listening to the both of us.
That's true, and I'll bet we charge more reasonable rates than the New York Times.
Probably we do. As someone who pays for the Times every single month, I think we have much more reasonable rates. We will continue this dissection of this particular piece of writing in our very next episode. That is going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder, but stay tuned for the next one. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.